Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. You'll have to excuse a little bit of coughing and congestion because it's spring. And forgive the outside noises. I don't know what they're doing out there. I don't know what they're doing. So we're coming back with a different book talk video today. I'm going to do things a little bit different. This will be a compare and contrast video between two books on the subject of Wicca. I'm going to compare and contrast them. These are two of the primary volumes that I used to read and study while I was practicing Wicca. The first one is going to be Scott Cunningham's Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. And I don't actually own a copy of this. Most of the books that I'm going to be reviewing on Wicca I've gotten from the library. And the second one is going to be Wicca for Beginners, Fundamentals of Philosophy and Practice by Thea Sabin. And this is, forgive the terrible cover, this is the only book on Wicca that I actually have purchased. Let me attempt. The cover is slightly glossy. Both of these are paperback. Excuse me. I don't think that there are hardcover editions. There should be, in my honest opinion, because the book cover was damaged when I originally got it. So, let's see. Compare and contrast. These are, if somebody were to ask me, based on my own experience as somebody who has practiced Wicca, if somebody came to me and asked, I'd like to start reading up on this topic, what books would you recommend? I would actually recommend both of these, not one more than the other. I would recommend both because both of them have some really valuable excuse me, points that I think it's nice to get both sets of views. Now, Scott Cunningham is one of the old school, very early mainstream Wiccan authors who wrote content for the general public. When I was coming up in Wicca, and by coming up I mean evolving on my spiritual path, because I practice open spirituality. I'm not strictly speaking Wiccan, though there are a lot of aspects of my own personal practice that align with Wicca and may aesthetically, so to speak, resemble Wicca in many ways. I don't think that I would be classified strictly speaking as Wiccan. I prefer the term open spirituality because I think it's more accurate for what I do. But when I was coming up in Wicca, I don't know what it's like now. Everybody read Scott Cunningham. Everybody knew who Scott Cunningham was. There wasn't a single person who practiced Wicca. I might be slightly exaggerating it, but I would say probably 99% of all Wiccans had read Scott Cunningham, even if they didn't own a copy of their books. Even people who weren't Wiccan were familiar with Scott Cunningham's work from the academic perspective, or at least they were aware of it. People who study various religions and different spiritual traditions. So I would say that both of these books have a lot of good material. Some of the content is going to be similar, but each one gives its own unique take on them. I will show you. There are actually some illustrations, basic layouts in Scott Cunningham's book for reference. Scott Cunningham is, like I said, one of the foundational sources for a lot of information on Wicca. Also, I would say probably one of the most easily accessible, at least it was for me when I started out. I started out when there wasn't really a whole lot of mainstream books on this topic. There are far more now than there were when I started. So Scott Cunningham and Raymond Buckland were the two primary sources for me after Thea Sabin. Well, actually, Scott Cunningham and Raymond Buckland were first. I've read Raymond Buckland's work. I've read, I wouldn't say all of Scott Cunningham's books, but I've read most of them. And I kind of pull from different sources. If I had to describe the writing styles, I would say Scott Cunningham is like, since the title implies this is a guide for the solitary practitioner, Scott Cunningham writes in a way that is, I wouldn't say necessarily academic, but it's a book that was written specifically for solitaries, which is exactly what it sounds like. Somebody who is practicing Wicca by themselves. So someone who is not part of a group, aka coven. Because at the time that he was writing this, you didn't have sources for solitaries. Now you got all kinds of stuff. Plus, social media and YouTube has been thrown into the mix. But when this book came out, you didn't have any of that. So he writes more from the perspective of a teacher. And it is very much geared towards helping you figure out your own solitary practice. I'm going to give you an example, both of the typeface and of one of the simple diagrams that is in the book. So this is one of the basic ideas of how you can set up an altar, the basic traditional Wiccan layout for an altar setup. So you see you have the goddess side, the god side, and an essential portion where they meet. What each side symbolically represents, in other words. So this is more like a textbook. Here's another example of a suggested altar layout when you're placing various items and tools on it. I hope this is going to turn out well on camera. I'm doing this later in the day. So he is more like, it's like reading something that an actual teacher wrote. Now, Thea Sabin, I recommend, how should I put it? I would put her more in the category of your friendly neighborhood witch who just happens to write a book on witchcraft. And if you came over to her house and said, say, tell me about this Wicca stuff, she'd say, okay. And you would just sit down over a cup of tea and chat. It's, would I say it's less academic? Yeah, in some sense, it is. I'll give you an example of the typeface here, and this is Wicca for Beginners by Thea Sabin. And there's an example of the typeface. Both of these are printed on white paper, so it's black on white as opposed to black on cream. I would say also that if you want something that is has more of a feel of just sitting down with a neighbor over a cup of tea talking about stuff in the comfort of your own home, Thea Sabin's book would be the book to get. If you want something that is more more like actually listening to a traditional Wiccan teacher, then that would be Scott Cunningham's book. Thea Sabin also doesn't really include, if I recall correctly, yeah, she doesn't include any diagrams or drawing or artwork, whereas Scott Cunningham's book does. Excuse me. Both of them give really good explanations about what Wicca is or should be versus what Wicca isn't or shouldn't be. For instance, on what Wicca, coming under the category of what Wicca should be, um, ideally, these are my own words now, honoring, just an example, honoring both the goddess and the god equally, relatively equally, not being biased more towards one side or the other, ideally, again, because there are plenty of people who practice various forms of Wicca who prefer to lean more one side or the other. But it's a place where if you wanted to have both the goddess and the god represented equally and work with both equally in tandem, you can. There's no prejudice towards that. Or against that. There's no feeling of, no, you have to work specifically with the god, or you have to work specifically with the goddess, or the god has to always be dominant, or the goddess always has to be dominant. Now, there are various Wiccan traditions that work exclusively with the goddess. Dianic Wicca, as the name implies, primarily works with the goddess Diana. I'm not as familiar with those different traditions because I was never a part of a specific tradition. I always practiced solitary. So also, it's a system that, well, actually a religion, that allows for the practice of magic, but doesn't demand necessarily that you practice magic. Practicing magic, practicing, quote, witchcraft, unquote, casting spells and such, is typically what we associate Wicca with, but for me, I feel that it's important to point out that it is not a requirement. Most people, they hear Wicca, they instantly think of witchcraft. Strictly speaking, Wicca is a religion that is not necessarily dependent on witchcraft. It allows for witchcraft. It encourages a particular framework for witchcraft. It encourages a particular ethical standard for witchcraft. But that doesn't mean to say that if you're going to be a Wiccan, then you also have to practice witchcraft and you also have to call yourself a witch. You don't. There are plenty of people who don't cast spells, and yet they're Wiccan. I don't predominantly cast spells. Even when I was a practicing Wiccan, I didn't typically cast spells. Now, have I cast spells? Yes, I will admit that. I have cast spells. Had very interesting results, too. Another story for another time. But for most of my time, I didn't do anything like that. Did that make me less of a Wiccan? No. No. Now, there may be some people who would say yes. There may be some people who would say, well, what's the point in having anything to do with Wicca if you're not going to practice witchcraft? Well, I didn't go to Wicca in order to practice witchcraft. Yes, that was one of my interests. And yes, I did feel drawn to that. But that wasn't really the driving force between wanting to learn more about it. I came to it because I wanted open spirituality. I came to it because I wanted a connection to God that was not necessarily something that the church would have approved of. That was my reasoning and my way of thinking at the time. Not to go into a whole spiel about my spiritual path. That's that's not what a book talk video is for. I mean, if people want to hear about it, that's fine. I'll mention it. But in terms of, again, what Wicca is, it is a religion that allows for the adoption of a pantheon, pretty much any pantheon that you want. Again, it's not something that you have to do. Strictly speaking, I'm trying to think of exactly how to put this in a way that's not too confusing. The only thing that, if we were to strip Wicca down to its bare essentials, the honoring of both the goddess and the god equally together is really one of the only, for lack of a better way of putting it, deity requirements in Wicca. At least the recognition that you have both a goddess and a god, as opposed to just a goddess or just a god. But you can adopt multiple deities from other pantheons if you wanted to. Again, it's not something that you're required to do. But if you feel led to do that, if you feel a strong pull towards a particular deity in a particular pantheon, or if you have an interest in a particular culture, you have an interest maybe even in a particular time in history, there's nothing wrong with including that. So it provides leeway, enough leeway for you to explore, while at the same time trying to maintain at least a certain ethical standard via the Wiccan read, typically. Now, in terms of what Wicca isn't or shouldn't be, ideally, they point out that, for instance, it's not an excuse to hex people, go around hexing people, looking for somebody who's gonna, I don't know, turn your ex-boyfriend into a toad or whatever. Because there are some weird people out there who actually think that that can happen, or at least wish that it could happen. Not that I'm judging. You do you. It's not, I also want to say, from my own personal experience, and they do touch on this in different ways, but I'm going to say this in a more broad term, more all-encompassing, or at least try to. It's not an excuse to dabble in witchcraft or the occult. There are a lot of people, I think, who have gotten into either Wicca or something similar to Wicca, or even under the broad umbrella term of New Age, because they wanted to dabble. That's not what it's about, and it's not advisable. Speaking from experience, which I'm not going to go into, it's also not a way for you to gain fame, fortune, an ego boost, any of that. It's not an excuse to be promiscuous. There is, if it was possible to say that there's a taboo against certain intimate practices within Wicca, I would say that yes, largely because Wiccans are very conscious about the fact that you need to be in a position where your free will is not being infringed on, your mind is clear, you're not being coerced. If somebody is saying, well, if you want to learn from me, you're going to have to do certain things, head for the hills, head for the hills, which any reputable Wiccan is going to tell you that that is, not only is it immoral and illegal, it also goes against what Wiccans believe and what Wiccans practice. It is also, I want to say, and I want to make a point of this because I brought up the Wiccan read, Wicca does not follow the precepts of Satanism. Yes, I will say that one of the primary tenets of the Wiccan read does come from Aleister Crowley. I am fully aware of that, believe me. Believe me. And I will also say that I never was in full support of that particular passage. it was also, at least when I was regularly practicing Wicca, it was really the only portion of the Wiccan Rede that caused any contention. Surprise, surprise. Wonder why. Now, if somebody else wants to get involved with that, well, that's on them. Fine. Do you, like I said. But that is not something that I personally ever adhered to. That particular portion I never adhered to because my intuition said you can't really trust that. That's the wording is a little bit funny. Let's just leave that alone, and if we decide to adopt it later, we can. Don't have to make a decision about it now, but for right now, I'm just going to follow my intuition, and I'm glad I did because that was what worked for me. For somebody else, it might be different. I will also, well, I suppose I should mention, just for anybody who is going to ask me, what's the Wiccan Rede? The Wiccan Rede, in short, I'm not going to do a full dissertation on it, is like the Wiccan version, if I had to equate it to anything, it's like the Wiccan version of the Ten Commandments / the Pledge of Allegiance. Because, and I compare it to the Pledge of Allegiance because when I decided to practice Wicca, part of what I personally did for me was recite the Wiccan Rede, leaving out the Aleister Crowley portion. And I compare it to the Ten Commandments because, strictly speaking, the Rede is not necessarily about practicing magic, it's rules to live by. So it doesn't pertain just to coven work, spell work. It's general terms that you want to live by. Take care of the earth. Be kind to your fellow man. Try not to judge. And then you also have the threefold law, or the law of three. If you want more about it, you can always read it in the books, or maybe I'll bring it up some other time, because I do have other Wiccan books that I'm intending to review. These books also, I wanted to say, finally, something that is both similar as well as different. Both of these books have a portion where, excuse me, they talk about basic correspondences. Correspondences meaning things such as, well, get off, thank you. Correspondences meaning things like certain days of the week, things that certain days of the week are associated with. Herbs that are good for offerings, honoring different deities, the various plants and stones that are, at least historically or mythologically, considered to be associated with a particular deity or particular work. Now, I will say, however, that if you want more complete information on those subjects, I would not get either of these books because they're not books specifically dedicated to herbs, specifically dedicated to crystals, specifically dedicated to oils or anything like that. Particularly because as somebody who does work with herbs, some herbs you can burn, some you can't. Some are safe for consumption, some are not. So, and neither of these books go into which ones are safe for burning. So unless you already know, or unless you make a point to look it up, and you wanted to, let's say, make an incense blend, I would not recommend just going to, let's say, the Scott Cunningham book and looking up the correspondences for some of the different gods and goddesses and saying, oh, okay, Bridget likes blackberries, so therefore I can burn blackberries. Don't burn anything unless you know 100% beyond a shadow of a doubt that the particular portion of the plant that you are burning is safe to burn, because the smoke that comes off of that may be toxic. Just saying that there is a reason why there are books that specialize, and people who actually specialize on what you should and shouldn't burn, what you should and shouldn't eat, what you should and shouldn't drink, what you should and shouldn't combine. There's a reason for that. Don't poison yourself, okay? Don't poison yourself. Don't poison your critters. Don't poison your plants. However, these are, I would say that I would use these, and I did use these as much as I could, for basic information on, let's say, little things that you can put on the altar if you decide to put something on an altar, if you decide to make one. Little things that you could put on there as a physical offering that you don't burn. It's not consumed in any way, you just sit it there, and that's really all that you have to do. So for instance, if you wanted to offer apple, well, apple is fine, and you could just leave an apple slice there. Olive, let's see, juniper, fig, different things, cinnamon. So those are things that you could just place in a container and leave. Or if it is safe to leave it out in nature, you could leave it out in nature as an offering too, because there are a lot of people who, instead of putting everything on the altar when they give an offering, they just go out in the backyard, sit something on the ground, and that's it. So I would recommend both of these books, because I think if you want an easy introduction, if you want something that's easy to read, if you want something that is very user-friendly, both Scott Cunningham's Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, and Thea Sabin's Wicca for Beginners, Fundamentals of Philosophy and Practice are both good reads. I only ever purchased Thea Sabin's book primarily because by the time I was in a position to purchase books on Wicca, I felt that it wasn't really necessary for me to anymore, because I got everything from the library. That was how I had to do it. And I mean, do I regret it? No. I might even still at some point purchase these books just as reference material, even if I don't actively use them, because I'm a little bit beyond the information contained in them. So I hope this was a good review for you. Also, one more thing is that the table of contents, both of these books have table of contents. You know I'm big on table of contents, and they are divided up pretty well. This is a Scott Cunningham book. So you have sections on theory, and here is where you find a lot of the semi-standard definitions of different words, things like meditation, journeying, things like that. Practice, and that's where you get into things like trying to sense the energy of a stone, noticing how you react to different sounds, just becoming more aware of the things that trigger you in different ways. The way that a certain sound might make you feel sad, another makes you feel more uplifted. Shielding, visualization, which is a good practice, even if you're not Wiccan, in my opinion, because you got some pretty nasty gunk out there. And then you also have Scott Cunningham includes a small book of shadows, which is like a workbook of basic rituals that you can do, that you can start out with. So that's the Scott Cunningham book. And then in Thea Sabin's book, She also has a table of contents, which I will show you. Let's see. Starting with basic information about what Wicca is. This print is a little bit smaller. The print in her book is a little bit smaller. It's also, the format of the book is, see, the size comparison. So her typeface is, well, they're about the same, but it seems like this one is a little bit smaller. So her table of contents is not divided up into sections. It's just divided up into chapters, but it's still really easy to read. And she goes into the purposes of the different tools, getting to know the Wiccan gods, the 4 elements, the 4 quarters, the circle, meditation, visualization. Excuse me. So, yes, I would recommend either or both of these books. I think that if you are getting one, because sometimes there's so many books out there now, especially on basic Wicca or beginner Wicca, it can feel redundant. But I would, generally speaking, if I were going into Wicca again for the first time, would I read a lot of the newer books first? No. Largely because I like to start with some of the earliest foundational authors, and then if I want to, I can work forward. Because so much of what everybody else has done is based on Scott Cunningham, Raymond Buckland, etc., the early big name authors. So I hope that this was an interesting book review, book talk, and that if you are interested in getting one or either of these books, that it helped you make that decision. So, hope you're having a good day. Glad I was able to get this video in while the light was good, and that it wasn't too noisy. I hope my explanations were clear too, and that I didn't cough too much, because allergies are a bummer. I really need a crystal for that. No, just kidding. Just kidding. Okay. Have a good day. Bye.